pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening. Jon Cotton hardly needs any introduction to this society because I believe he's spoken on at least 4 occasions in the past, most recently in February 2018 when he spoke about One Thames or Two, the archaeology of London's rivers. Jon tells me he's worked at the Museum of London for more than 30 years and he was senior curator in prehistory from 1991 to 2011, but he's now a freelance archaeological consultant and is a particular expert on everything relating to West London. So without more ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to Jon Cotton for his talk this evening with the enticing title, "In This Heath Hath Many Camps Been Pitched," the subtitle of which is the West London Landscape Project in context. So we're delighted to hear from you, Jon, and thank you very much indeed for joining us in these unusual circumstances. So over to you, Jon.
Thank you very much. Now, if I can pull up my screen, here we go. Oop. Let me just see if I can sort the technology. Hang on. Now,
click on the green button at the bottom, share screen.
Hang on. And where are we? Just a moment. Share screen. There we go.
And then click on the slides themselves.
There you are, defeated at the first hurdle by technology.
That's brilliant, Jon. So just start the slides now. Lovely. Thank you.
See that?
Yeah, that's super.
And everybody can hear me.
Yes.
Okay.
You just need to click on Start Slides from the beginning if you haven't already. That left button
beginning.
there. Yeah, that's it. It's lovely.
Right. Well, it is a great pleasure to be with you all this evening, if only by the wonders of Zoom technology. And hopefully it won't be too long before we can all meet again in person. Now, can I just right at the start apologise? I have a noisy cat sitting on the table here, so if there are any interjections of a feline variety, you'll know where it's coming from. It's not me, it's my cat. Anyway, in preparing his 1635 map of Isleworth 100 for the Duke of Northumberland, Dunstable-born Isleworth resident and mapmaker Moses Glover included a marginal note against Hounslow Heath. He wrote, "In this heath hath many camps been pitched, whereof the form of 2 yet in part remaineth, not far beyond this river," the River Crane, "by the name of Shaftesbury Hills." Now that's where my title, "In This Heath Hath Many Camps Been Pitched," comes from. And I want in this talk to explore something of the many camps which we were able to locate during the West London Landscapes Project, which is an Historic England funded programme which attempts to round up the results of 10 excavations carried out in the London boroughs of Hillingdon and Hounslow over a nearly 20-year period between about 1979 through to 1997, something like that. So, but this evening, of course, is really all about these two, Kirsty and Phil, or at least it's all about their catchphrase: location, location, location. That's the key to understanding what I'm going to be talking about. It is all about location. And this very famous view, which I'm sure many of you will recognise as being taken from the top of Richmond Hill looking west, helps us to focus on location, as it provides what is in effect a distant view of the project area. The flat horizon that you can see across the screen there gives the game away because it provides in effect a distant view of the project area, and it gives the game away for the sites within the project all lie on the level expanses of gravel terrace of the River Thames, which were laid down progressively from around about 500,000 years or so ago. Now, the project area comprises a large swathe of Taplow Terrace in the area around Heathrow, particularly around Heathrow and the area to the north of Heathrow, much of which makes up a large proportion of what was formerly Hounslow Heath. The heath originally extended across 14 parishes, from Harmondsworth in the north to Hampton in the south. And I've marked on the map, you can see there, Richmond Hill. You know where you are in Ruislip, but you might not know where I am in Kingston, and you probably won't know where the project area is, which I've highlighted in that black rectangle. Now, much of the northern part of that area is capped by a thick, undulating deposit of wind-blown loess, which is often known locally as brick earth. And that's shown as an orange tone. Just in there, you can see that a big black block of orange tone, which is part of a rather wider swathe of brick earth, which runs across those West London terraces, all the way in virtually to the City of London, which is just in there. Now, the brick earth is so called because it provided the raw material used to fire the bricks that fueled the London housing boom of the 18th and 19th centuries. Prior to the commencement of the West London Landscapes project in 1979, the area was already known to produce an interesting array of objects. Notable finds include Paleolithic flint tools from the gravel pits in the sort of West Drayton, Useley, Dawley areas, close to the Grand Junction Canal, under what is now mainly Stockley Park, actually. And many of these are in the Museum of London's collection, including these four rather fine ones you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. We've also got a record of a small, now unfortunately lost, late Bronze Age bronze hoard, comprising these two socketed axes, which you can see on the screen here. And you might be able to read that. It says, with cakes of copper, Starvall, near West Drayton, Mr. J.G. Russell of Slough. The only record we've got of this particular hoard is this little piece of paper, which is now in Slough Museum. The hoard itself is long lost, which is a great shame. And the third thing you can see on the screen, bottom right there, is a string of Saxon glass beads, which were found in an urn during gravel digging at Longford as long ago as 1780. The urn doesn't survive, but the beads do, and they're now in the British Museum. Now, historically, the area is perhaps best known for this site, and this is Caesar's Camp, which was visited by various early antiquaries such as Camden and Aubrey, and surveyed by William Stukely in 1723, and it's Stukely up on the screen there, top left. Intriguingly, the local place name was Shakespeare Hill, which is what Moses Glover referred to in his 1635 map. It's possible that Shakespeare Hill is an Old English corruption of Shaftesbury, meaning the robber's fort, which is suggesting that this area of Hounslow Heath had earned a rather sort of dubious reputation much further back in time than the 18th century highwaymen that are most often associated with it these days. The site itself, which you can see the rather fine sort of earthwork enclosure itself, was excavated in 1944 by W.F. Grimes and found to comprise an Iron Age settlement of circular houses, 8 or 9 circular houses, and a rectangular shrine. And I want to come back to the shrine a little bit later on. And I don't know if any of you have seen the film The Dig on Netflix, but if you have, you'll perhaps recall that Billy Grimes, W.F. Grimes, worked alongside Ralph Fiennes' character Basil Brown at Sutton Hoo just prior to the Second World War. And just to orientate you a little bit on the screen here, this is the Bath Road, which you can see running across the top of Stukely's etching. Here is Stukely himself in his clerical garb down here at the bottom right, and he's obviously superintending a sort of chain survey of the earthwork, having just dismounted from this rather sort of fine coach and six you can see drawn up here. It's a really splendid etching, this. And as you can see there, it says Caesar's Camp on Hounslow Heath, 18th of April, 1723. The name Caesar's Camp is a complete fiction of Stukely's. Locals would have known this as Shakespeare Hill. Now, following Grimes' pioneering work at Heathrow, many sites have been examined in the lee of the airport since, well, the 1970s, I guess, the early or late 60s, early 70s. And these include the work conducted by Roy Canham at the western end of runway 1, that's out here, where I'm circling the cursor, and by Nick Farrant and John Alexander at West Bedfont, further to the southeast. That's down here. I'll come back to this area in a little bit when I talk about one of the sites down here. Now, the West London Landscape Project sites are the ones highlighted in red. Those big red dots are all sites that we looked at or pulling together as part of the West London Landscapes Project. While the position of Stukely's Caesar's Camp I've marked with a black rectangle, and it survives, as far as we're aware, under the eastern end of the main northern runway. So it's probably still there under the tarmac. So essentially then, the West London landscape sites of 1979-97 follow on from these earlier archaeological programs, those of Grimes and Canham and Farrant, and act as the prequel, if you will, for the later major projects which were carried out around the airport at places like Prospect Park, up near Harmondsworth, which is sort of up in this area, that site there. Terminal 5 at Perry Oaks, this site here, which is now under the Terminal 5 buildings. Imperial College Sports Ground, which is in there. And Sipson Farm, which is this site here, just adjacent to Imperial College Sports Ground. And I'll refer to some of the results from those sites as well as we go forward. Now, in the 40 minutes or so that I'm going to spend talking about the project, I can't really do much more than sketch in some of the main highlights. But I hope by so doing, I can give you a bit of a flavour of some of the results and importance of the project. Now, many of these West London landscape sites, especially those between the A4 and the M4, were examined during the extraction or in advance of the extraction of deep commercially valuable gravel deposits. That's what the area is known for. However, our work concentrated on archaeological features which had been cut into the surface of the brick earth, which overlies and seals the gravels. And the brick earth, while free draining and very fertile, is not easy digging. It's prone to droughtiness in the summer, which bakes it rock solid, and it's very, very prone to waterlogging in winter, leading to sort of poaching and a squelchy mess, which makes archaeological features extremely difficult to spot and excavate. So we had particular difficulties with a lot of this stuff in terms of the sheer physical excavation. Now, unlike the earlier higher gravel terraces further to north, which have produced all those flint tools that I spoke about earlier on, very few have been recorded from the Taplow terrace gravels around Heathrow. We only have a single battered example, which you can see on the right of the screen, I think, which was retrieved from the conveyor belt, which was taking it to the crusher at Holloway Lane. One of the site workers happened to see it going along the conveyor belt and just flipped it off with his shovel, which allowed us to record it. So we don't have very large numbers of these earliest flint tools. But what we do have is the unexpected, very unexpected discovery of a single late Neanderthal hand axe, which you can see on the left of the screen here, just on the moment of discovery by John Mills. This was a really unexpected bonus. And it was found towards the base of the brick earth at Woolgarden Farm in Sipson Lane. It dates to a very specific period of human recolonisation of Britain between around 60,000 to 40,000 years ago, and is one of a small number of these sorts of hand axes made by late Neanderthal hominins from the Thames Valley. Now, its position suggests that it probably lay on a late Pleistocene land surface, sealed by the brick earth, which is an observation of very high significance, very, very interesting in situ location for this particular hand axe. So often they turn up as stray finds. This one has got a very, very good archaeological context. Now, the climate at the time it was made and used would have been intensely cold. and the local landscape was probably little more than sort of treeless open mammoth steppe, as the rather splendid artist reconstruction on the right of the screen shows. It's a band of late Neanderthal hunters operating in the Thames Valley, tracking this herd of mammoth you can see going across the screen. So it's a very, very significant find, this one. And you might just be able to notice the very worn surface. The upper surface of the axe is very, very worn. And it may well have been that it was lying out on one of these very cold sort of deposits under the most extreme cold conditions, with wind and sand whipping across the surface. So the upper surface of the axe here has almost been sandblasted. The condition of the other face, which you can't see in this picture, is very, very much crisper and fresher, and looks as though it was protected from the worst effects of the cold climate. So that's the period between about 60 and 40,000 years ago. Now, evidence for later anatomically modern hunter-gatherer activity is limited within the West London Landscapes project area, but that simply might mean that the hunting parties operating out of home camps in the valley floors, like this one, which is in the floor of the Colne Valley on the former Sanderson site in Uxbridge, like you can see on the screen here, they were there, but they were simply not leaving archaeologically recoverable traces in the woodlands that eventually came to dominate those areas of terrace gravel, the sort of mixed lime, mixed oak woodlands out on the terraces, were no doubt being used by the hunters, but they simply weren't depositing anything that we can recover before they returned to their home bases in these valley floors. Now, at the Sanderson site, activity on the banks of the River Colne seems to have centred on a single hearth, which you can see marked red on the right-hand side of the screen, and into which a handful of hazelnut shells had been thrown. And struck flint from tool making littered the whole area, along with bones of roe deer and red deer, many of which had been broken up, crunched up to extract the fat-rich marrow. So this is an intensively utilised small area focused on a hearth adjacent to an active stream channel of the Colne, sometime around about 10,000 years ago. But a very, very interesting and a key site. Now, if the evidence for hunter-gatherer activity across the West London landscape area is slim, the succeeding Neolithic period, the period between about 4,000 and 2,000 years BC, is very much better represented. Initially, as trees were felled by scattered communities to create clearings in the natural wild wood. And the earliest evidence comprises isolated clay and timber houses, and you can see one or two of these dotted about in clearings in the artist's reconstruction on the right of the slide here. And this phase of pioneering activity within the wild woods was followed a little later by the construction of large earthen monuments, which presumably represent communal efforts on the part of these communities and suggest that the land may have been held in common as part of a sort of communal ownership of land. Now, within the West London Landscapes project, the earliest Neolithic structure is a small rectangular two-bay house, which we very luckily uncovered at Cranford Lane. And this lay amongst a tangle of features, which you can see. Here's the remains of the structure here, but you can see all this tangle of greenery going on around it. These appear to be the former positions of cleared trees. So they've cleared the area, constructed this little two-bay house within it. It measures about 8 meters by 6 meters in overall area. The interesting thing about this site is that the house only survived because it lay beneath the higher ridge of an expanse of medieval ridge and furrow agriculture. So here are the medieval furrows, these linear brown lines, and here are in between are the higher ridges, and you can see how the house survives between two furrows beneath the ridge. It's only that little bit of sheer good luck that enabled us to recover the footprint of this house. Now, though it's not independently dated, the pottery and the flint found within the house footprint suggest that the structure is directly comparable to 4 houses which have been scientifically dated to the 38th and 37th centuries BC at Lower Horton, just over the Colne to the west, one of which you can see at the top right-hand side of the slide. This one here, with an artist's reconstruction of what this structure might have looked like below. And you can see in broad terms how closely similar the outline of this 2-bay structure is to the rather knocked about example we had down at Cranford Lane. It's more or less the same sort of size, and I suspect more or less the same sort of age. Now, the dating isn't sufficiently precise to show whether the 4 Horton structures were all occupied at the same time as each other, or whether they represent successive phases of activity within a specific area. But either way, it seems likely that these and the Cranford Lane structure were probably built and occupied by a single extended family group, perhaps no more than 7, 10 or a dozen people. Now, it was these individual groups, these individual family groups of people that came together on occasion to construct much larger communal monuments of earth and timber. And these are often referred to as causewayed enclosures because of the many gaps in the ditches that define them. And you can see from this aerial photograph of the site down at Riding Court Farm, Datchet near Windsor, all the causeways, the gaps between the sort of sausages of ditch. Now, a series of these monuments are known from this part of the Thames Valley. We've got Riding Court Farm, Datchet, you'll see on the left of the screen here, and Yoveney Lodge Staines, much further into the Colne Valley, and an artist's reconstruction of that site by Alan Sorrell on the right of the screen. Now, these appear to date just slightly later than the houses. They're about the 37th to 35th centuries BC, just slightly later than the currency of the rectangular houses. They seem to be just a smidge earlier, just a bit earlier in date. But I hope you can see the causeways between the ditches, which give these very distinctive enclosures their name, causewayed enclosures. Now, further possible causewayed enclosure, which first showed up as a crop mark on aerial photographs taken in the late 1940s, was evaluated as part of the West London Landscapes project at Mayfield Farm, East Bedfont, on the southeastern side of Heathrow, down near where Nick Farrant and John Alexander had done some work in the 1970s. This lay on a low eminence at the very edge of the Heathrow Terrace and overlooked a wide expanse of the Thames Valley to the south. So here is this big double-ditched enclosure, which is something like, it extends round under these houses, something like 250 metres in diameter. So it's very, very large. And here's the terrace edge. So it looks as though it butts against the edge of the terrace here on a slight eminence and looking down to the south, down here, across the Thames Valley. It's a really, really interesting site, this one. But sadly, the limited excavation we were able to do across the ditches didn't produce much in the way of conclusive dating evidence. And the ditch profiles were slightly different. The inner ditch was V-shaped, and was flat-bottomed, and the outer ditch was V-shaped. And the difference in those two ditch profiles rather suggests to me, anyway, that they may have been dug at different times. And as such, it may be that the Mayfield Farm enclosure saw at least more than one very specific phase of use. One might be Neolithic, one might be later. Now, other major communal monuments from the Heathrow area include the so-called Stanwell cursus. And you can see a reconstructed section, a reconstructed length of that cursus on the right of the screen here. These two big side ditches there, and a central bank here. This comprised, the Stanwell cursus comprised an embanked avenue over 4 kilometres in length, that ran along underneath the western edge of Heathrow. Now, this must be a major statement on the part of local communities, and it could well mark the boundary between the Colne floodplain and the higher Heathrow terrace, along which processions could make their way at certain times of the year. It's a very, very interesting site, this one. Now, the plan I've put up on the screen here provides a summary of early Neolithic sites in the area. So here's our Cranford Lane house here. Here's the Bedfont Mayfield Farm possible causewayed enclosure. Now there's a large gap. You can see that causewayed enclosures here at Dorney, at Eaton Wick, at Datchet, and at Yoveney Lodge Staines. Over 70 kilometres separate Yoveney Lodge Staines from the next confirmed causewayed enclosure, which is down in Orsett in Essex, right the other side of urban Greater London. Now this is an unfeasibly large gap in the distribution of these causewayed enclosures along the river, and it seems very likely that there must have been others. West Bedfont is a possibility, the Mayfield Farm site that I've just spoken about, and in addition there are two other sites which I think could well be very significant in terms of causewayed enclosure status. This one here at Church Street, Twickenham, and a second one here at Kew Bridge near Brentford. This one here at Twickenham was excavated in the 1960s by the local society, and this one at Kew Bridge was excavated in the noughties by pre-construct archaeology. And finds from the river, certainly adjacent to the Brentford site, the Kew Bridge site here, rather underline its likely significance and importance. And I rather suspect that these two may well turn out to be more enclosures, large enclosures of this causewayed enclosure class. Sort of finds from the river I'm talking about include this flint axe, which you can see at the top of the screen on the right there, which was found during the construction of the new Kew Bridge in 1902, and is now rather splendidly displayed in this sort of plush velvet-lined case. It was presented to Edward VII when he opened the bridge in 1902 and is now in the Museum of London. And below it you can see this little early Neolithic pottery cup, which was dredged out of the river at Strand-on-the-Green, just immediately downstream of Kew Bridge. Other finds from the river downstream of Brentford include human skulls, including, we've got one here, part of one anyway, the frontal bone of a male skull from Putney, which has been radiocarbon dated to the 37th century BC, and this alderwood club you can see on the right of the screen, which is just slightly later, dated to the 36th century BC. It's made of alderwood. It's about the same size as a cricket bat or a baseball bat, and would, we suspect, have functioned as some sort of war club. So there's a lot of stuff from the river which goes alongside these finds, set back on the river gravel terraces. Now, from the high water mark of the early Neolithic, the period between, say, about 4000 and 3300, 3400 BC, the archaeological signal seems to diminish during the late 4th and much of the 3rd millennia BC. And it looks from this as though there were generally fewer people about, and that swathes of previously open landscape had fallen into something approaching disuse or desertion. And certainly when new earthen monuments were built during this time, they tend to be small and rather modest structures. And I've got three on the screen here. This one here at Mayfield Farm, which you can probably just make out as a sort of penannular enclosure running around there with an entrance on its eastern side. This is only about 16 metres in diameter. It's quite small. And these two ring ditches out at Imperial College Sports Ground are about the same sort of size, or a little bit smaller. Now these sort of monuments may well have been constructed by and used by these small family groups again, rather than any wider community. There's no sort of sense of communal activity going on here. These seem to be rather more private family monuments. But there is also some evidence for repurposing of some of the larger corset enclosures at this time, but on a limited scale. Now, the clearest archaeological signal in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC is provided by groups of shallow bowl-shaped pits, backfilled with broken pieces of pottery, struck flint, and charred botanical remains like hazelnut shells, sloe stones, crabapple pips, pear pips, that sort of stuff. And the hazelnut shells in particular, the hazelnuts rather, seem to have replaced wheat as the main starchy plant food in the human diet during this period. We've got virtually all of these features produce charred hazelnut shells in them. And you can probably just see some burning down here in the bottom of this pit on the left of the screen. That's all charred hazelnut material. There's another black line there, which also at the bottom of that pit, also comprising charred hazelnut. On the right of the screen, you've got some of this beautiful pottery, beautifully decorated pottery, very, very carefully decorated, sort of herringbone zigzag impressed into the wet clay. And below it, this rather splendid chisel-ended arrowhead. This is the business end here. The idea being that this imposes a sort of wide bleeding wound on any animal that it strikes that you can follow into wooded terrain. Now, the pits themselves also seem to diminish in number over time, so that by the period when flat-based tubs known as grooved-ware, this pottery you can see on the right of the screen here, by the time this is in use, which is in broadly the period between about 3000 and 2000 BC, the local landscape appears again to have been deserted, or perhaps as only intermittently or seasonally exploited. Difficult to be clear, but there certainly seems to be, again, fewer people about, little activity going on. But again, notice the charring in the bottom of this pit here. Again, lots of charred hazelnut shells in there. Intriguingly, the grooved-ware, this sort of pottery here, is much more common further up the Thames Valley, up into sort of Oxfordshire and sort of North Wessex, and closer, funny enough, to the area of northern Wessex, where sites like Avebury and Stonehenge were under construction at around about this time. And I just wonder whether some of our local communities simply disappeared off up the Thames to help in the construction programmes that were going forward at sites like Avebury and Stonehenge. But for whatever reason, it looks as though the local West London landscape has been largely depopulated around about this time. Now, there are two spectacular finds that mark the transition between this suggested depopulation and a renewed cycler activity out on the terraced landscape in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, around about 1600 or 1500 BC. Now, the first of these comprises the burial of a woman at Lower Horton, just over the Colne to the west. Now, she was interred around about 2500 or 2400 BC and accompanied by a fine pottery beaker, which you can see on the screen to the left, and a series of jet and gold beads. The gold beads in particular are amongst the earliest metal objects known from Britain. There's very little earlier metalwork than these anywhere within the country. This early metalwork is usually gold and copper. But here at Lower Horton, we've got these gold beads. That's the first spectacular find, which marks this transition. And the second spectacular find, equally extraordinary, comprises the remains of a young, partially dismembered wild cow, known as an aurochs, with 6 flint arrowheads embedded within its carcass. Now, aurochsen had gone extinct in Britain by the end of the Bronze Age, but survived in parts of Europe until the early 17th century, long enough to have been immortalised in early woodcuts, as this sort of German example from the 16th century shows. Here you can see a chap hiding behind a tree, spearing this onrushing aurochs into the neck. The aurochs remains from Holloway Lane site at Holloway Lane, were accompanied, as I said, by 6 barbed and tanged flint arrowheads. And here you can see them on the right of the screen. And I've circled in red areas of damage to the arrowheads. And you can see that 2 of them, this one here and this one over here, have lost their tips. And these are very likely as a result of impact fractures in parts of the bony part of the aurochs skeleton. This too probably dates to the sort of latter part of the 3rd millennium BC, at a time when the landscape is largely depopulated. Now, by the middle of the 2nd millennium, say 1600, 1500 years BC, liftoff seems to have happened in terms of the large-scale recolonisation of the local landscape. Organised land holdings were seem to be independently established right across the Heathrow Terrace, and they seem to be worked from small farmsteads embedded within the field systems. And the latter are served by tracks and droveways and waterholes. Evidence from Perry Oaks, which you can see on the screen here, suggests the existence of a series of individual holdings. And each one of these long linear strips of fields may well have been a separate holding in the ownership of an individual family, an individual extended family group. Finds from the fills of the waterholes, which are often popped into the corners of fields, they include things like log ladders and a rather splendid handled wooden cup down here, hewn from a single piece of oak. Metalwork, like the side loop spearhead I've shown here on the top right hand of the slide, is rarely found in these domestic settings, but a lot of it seems to be going into the Thames, being deposited in the Thames, presumably for ritual purposes, and perhaps by communities like those up at Perry Oaks and elsewhere, who are journeying down to the river on occasion to make these offerings to the spirit of the river. Now, the scattered communities which were dotted about within these field systems were also served by a series of small flat grave cremation cemeteries. We've got a number of these now from West London, and they contain the cremated remains of members of communities interred in large pottery jars, like the one being lifted at the bottom right-hand corner down here. This is from the site at the Western International Market in Hayes, just on the River Crane. Now, the field systems and associated tracks and droveways cover much of the Heathrow Terrace, as I said, and this plan on the right of the screen here makes that very clear. The blank area in the middle is simply where Heathrow Airport is, so we don't have access to that area. But you can see all around how many field systems there are. This is Perry Oaks here, which I've just shown you. And we're going to go and have a look at Cranford Lane in a minute, just up here. Now, these field systems are a very influential part of the local landscape as we go forward in time. And the area must have begun to take a more familiar, perhaps even modern look from around this time, as this artist's reconstruction at the top here suggests. This is to modernise what is a sort of agricultural, efficient agricultural landscape. And that's what we're suggesting that much of that Heathrow Terrace looked like from around about 1600 or 1500 years BC. Now, stock handling seems to have become increasingly sophisticated. And individual field systems of the sort you can see here often feature what must be the remains of complicated gate systems to allow stock to be sorted and separated. Comparable perhaps to this modern example which I've shown at Temple Cressing out in Essex, where you've got a sort of sheep run with pens here and gates where you can control the stock. Much the same sort of thing is probably going on in these field systems out on the terrace. I'm going to look now at this site here at Cranford Lane, which was excavated by my colleague Nick Elsden. This is a typical sequence excavated during the West London Landscapes project at Cranford Lane. where land was taken up and enclosed from the middle of the second millennium BC. And pots like this were deposited in some of the ditches. These are the sort of pots that are often turning up both in cemeteries and on settlements. And this field system is being laid out from the middle of that second millennium BC with later expansion and elaboration. Now at Cranford Lane, we can detect, or we were able to detect, elements of an infield outfield system, with the infield focused on this little settlement up here, embedded within this field system here, this infield system, and the outfield comprising lower lying water meadows within the floodplain of the River Crane. So here's the boundary between the infield and the outfield. Everything to the west of that is infield. Everything to the east of that is outfield, with the River Crane about 700 meters over to the right of the screen. Part of a metal trackway was noted close to the junction between the two in this area here. So you've got this trackway leading in from the water meadows up onto the higher, drier ground of the terrace, and clearly this had been much used. It was the metalling was presumably thrown down to consolidate a boggy area, which was prone to churning by the passage of people and animals in from the water meadow. The entranceway, just here, where that red arrow is pointing, was also marked by a well or a water hole, into which have been tipped fragments of clay mould from the casting sword or a spearhead with a leaf-shaped blade, together with part of a clay crucible and a wooden trough. And here are those bits of clay mould you can see at the top right of the screen. Similar threshold deposits have been located on other sites. Doorways, thresholds, boundaries seem to be sort of magically charged. And it may be that the Cranford Lane deposit was an attempt to invoke sympathetic magic to guard the vulnerable entranceway leading from the water meadows. So you put in fragments of sword and spearhead mould in there to act as sort of sympathetic magical guardians of that entranceway. Now, the Bronze Age field systems and their associated track and droveways were likely to have remained in use down to the Roman period in some places, virtually without change. And we can in fact envisage the survival of mature hedge boundaries across the landscape, broadly the equivalent of long-established hedgerows in areas of Britain that could date back to the medieval period. And I've got on the screen here a slide which I took back in the 1980s at Burrows Cross on the western edge of Heathrow. It seems unbelievable now, looking back at it. This is the area near where Terminal 5 now is. But this is what it looked like in May and June in the latter part of the 1980s. Now, one such long-lived feature was noted also within the landscape at Stockley Park, Dorley. And this was clearly visible on an air photograph taken again in the late 1940s. Excavation in 1985 suggested that the two ditches flanked a central bank. Here they are. Here are the two ditches you can see on the aerial photograph, sort of dog-legged across that part of the landscape there. Here they are when we came to excavate them, and here it is under excavation, this double-ditched feature. Now, we're suggesting that this may well be a bank flanked by two ditches rather than a track or a droveway. It may well be that this bank was topped with a hedge or a wooden fence. And west of the embankment, west of this embanked linear feature here, lay this little unenclosed settlement, which we had opportunity to excavate during 1985. Now, this comprised 4 circular houses and at least 12 small 4-post structures, which are typically interpreted as above-ground granary buildings. On the face of it, the settlement is typical of the sort of aggregated farmsteads located right across the Heathrow area and beyond, as at Caesar's Camp and Perry Oaks, for example. I mean, you might employ the modern term village or hamlet describe these little settlements. Now, with multiple round houses, these sites might well qualify, as I said, as hamlets, although again, the number of houses lived in at any one time is often unclear. But thanks to radiocarbon dating, we're on much firmer ground at Stockley Park in identifying two very distinct phases of use with a short hiatus in between them. Each phase involved the use of 2 of the houses and 6 of the 4-post structures, suggesting the use of the settlement by one, again, extended family group of perhaps 7 to 10 people over a period in total of perhaps 5 or 6 human generations. Now, the best preserved structure in the settlement was this large round house, which you can see at the top left of the screen here, comprising a roundhouse with a substantial porch in the form of 2 massive posts set back within an encircling eaves drip gully. Here's one post, one porch post. There's the other porch post. So you've got to imagine a main entrance through there with this eaves drip gully encircling a clay and timber thatched, probably pitched thatched roof building of the sort you can see over on the right hand side of the screen here. The modern reconstructions show what this structure might have looked like in life and how the internal space down here might have been used. So a lot of activity would be around the doorway where you've got good light, good daylight, with sleeping and storage at the back of the house to the rear. This is a notable first for this period and allows us to date the occupancy of this site with unusually good precision. Oh, wait a minute. What am I doing here? I've got ahead of myself. Now, take that back. Let's go back. I've talked about the roundhouse. I'm now going to talk about these 4-post structures and the wet nature of the ground at Stockley Park made storage of grain in pits unfeasible. It would simply have rotted. Hence the need for above ground storage in these 4-post granary structures. And these were intended to keep the stored grain away from damp and obviously from vermin. Now, the 2 superimposed 4-posters you've got on the left of the screen here neatly encapsulate the 2 main phases of activity on the site, because clearly one had been replaced by another more or less on the same site, the same footprint. And the sort of thing we're thinking about is here's a typical one of these 4-posters reconstructed. Many of the individual post holes, of which the 4-posters comprise, contain large assemblages of charred grain, particularly spelt wheat, along with weed seeds. The absence of chaff, suggesting that the grain had already been threshed and winnowed, and it was basically being stored clean, as it were, ready for use. Now, the dating of these seeds provided much of the dating evidence on which the chronology of the site turns. One curious little structure defies a simple functional explanation, and it's comparable to others found elsewhere that are often referred to as shrines. And these include the notable group from the interior of Danebury Hill Fort, which I've shown on the top right of the screen here, and of course the famous example I mentioned earlier from Caesar's Camp at Heathrow. Here's the Heathrow example as a plan, and here it is as a photograph taken by Grimes in 1944. Excavated. Now, if the Stockley Park structure is indeed a shrine, you can see how small it is. It's a very small structure, comparable to some of these little ones here from Danebury. If the structure is indeed a shrine, it may have housed a deity whose job it was to guard the contents of the 4-post structures, because these contain the stored grain on which the settlement depended. So it was a crucial part of the settlement economy to have this stored grain kept in good order. This little shrine may have housed a deity whose job it was to oversee the safe keeping of that stored grain. Now, as I said earlier, it was the seeds of this grain that provided suitable material for radiocarbon dating. And we got a sequence of 29 dates back from Stockley. And with the use of Bayesian statistics, which involve the use of stratigraphy in alliance with probability, it allowed Alex Baylis to refine down the dating to what were in effect blocks of time equivalent to human generations. And you can see how close those two phases of activity are. Phase 1 between 495 and 420 BC, and phase 2 400 to 335 BC. So this is a really, really nice, tight group of dates, which is a notable first for the period. And it allows us to date the occupancy of the site with unusually good precision. Iron Age sites are often quite difficult to date. Stockley Park is one of the best dated sites in the country. It also, of course, furnishes solid real dates for associated items such as pottery and the clay loom weights. And the pottery is often not secured by good scientific dates. So again, Stockley is doubly significant. Now, it is the best and the most complete Iron Age farmstead examined during the West London Landscapes project. But intriguingly, it appears to have been totally abandoned after about 335 BC. There's no evidence for any later activity on the site whatsoever. No Roman activity, nothing. Which could suggest that the site itself was only ever perhaps a satellite settlement attached to something larger, possibly it was seasonally occupied. Once that need for its occupation ceased, it simply wasn't reoccupied. It simply vanished from the landscape until we came to excavate. Now, elsewhere, we can extend the story through the Iron Age and on into the Roman period. And a good example of this is Holloway Lane, further to the south. And here there's good evidence for activity dating from around about 400 BC through to the Roman period and beyond. And this seems to be embedded within parts of an earlier landscape, which is dominated by this sinuous track or droveway, which you can see snaking across the screen here. And finds from the fill of this ditch include things like this little pot here, and this rather fancy double spring-coiled brooch, dating probably to the 3rd century BC, something like that. This one's probably a little bit older than that, perhaps 4th or 5th century BC. Now, some of the pottery, like the pieces you can see down here with this curvilinear decoration, this is very closely similar to other carefully decorated globular bowls found further up the Thames in Berkshire and Oxfordshire, suggesting again wider links along the Thames Valley. Rather handsome pots, these curvilinear decorated things. Now, if we move on to the Roman period, the Roman conquest, appears to have had little immediate discernible effect on the West London landscape. Farming is an essentially conservative undertaking, and it's not surprising that settlements and connecting trackways should have continued in use, much as they had for the best part of 1,000 years or more. However, it could be that there were changes in ownership, or at least tenure, perhaps as early as the 60s, the AD 60s, as new arrangements began to be put in place following the Boudiccan Rebellion. Now, the major road, which links London to Brentford, Staines and Silchester, here's London, here's Brentford, here's Staines, and here's Silchester. So this road here, which was probably constructed in the AD 50s, just after the conquest, this lies some way to the south of our West London landscape sites, which are sort of up here, just in that area there. But as I said earlier, the long-established network of local tracks and droveways, some dating back perhaps to the Bronze Age, almost certainly remained in use. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, this continuity is best demonstrated within the West London Landscapes project at Holloway Lane. And here we've got a small ovoid enclosure, which appears to have formalised a rather more open, earlier Iron Age arrangement. Typically, no direct traces of any buildings could be identified, but there were blank areas within the enclosure, here and here, which I think could well have been occupied by surface-built structures of circular and rectangular form, of the sort I've shown in the artist's reconstruction on the right of the screen over here. Now, quantities of building material in the form of roofing and even hypercoarse tiles were found, along with a handful of plain floor tesserae, bits of mosaic floor, if you like. Though whether these building materials were used in a Roman way is open to question. They may simply represent the use of materials to build ovens, hearths, or to sort of furnish thresholds within otherwise clay and timber buildings. And likewise, the pottery includes fragments of new types of vessel like mortaria for grinding up food and amphorae for storing wine and olive oil. But whether, again, these need not necessarily indicate the adoption of Roman ways of eating or drinking. There's certainly Romanized vessels present on the site. One single tooth apart, we've got no direct trace of the human inhabitants of this settlement, although we've got a grave-shaped feature in the fields out to the west, out here. You see it marked there, which contained pottery, but no bone. The bone had all dissolved. Burials on these Roman rural sites are surprisingly rare. You don't often come across them. We've got locally 5 from Prospect Park out at Harmondsworth, and a small group from the Lee at Denham, further up the Colne Valley. In addition, Redford and Riches mentioned the discovery of Roman sepulchres near Harefield in the early part of the 19th century, although, as with all such early sort of references, you need perhaps to take that with a pinch of salt. Those sepulchres could have been of prehistoric date. Now, despite the presence of Roman building material, tiles and tesserae, timber was the most important building material at the time. The poet Edward Thomas referred to wood as the 5th element, after earth, air, fire and water. And surviving stands of woodland must have been prized possessions, and were no doubt extensively managed by pollarding and coppicing to maximise yields of structural building timber, brushwood for kilns and ovens and hearths, and charcoal for cooking and ironworking. Now, local woodlands on the London Clay to the north of the West London Landscape Project may well have been managed since at least the latter stage of the Bronze Age, as hinted at by this late Bronze Age spearhead, which was found buried at the foot of a tree deep within Park Wood in Ruislip. I'm sure all of you will know. Now, the undoubted economic value of these woodlands suggests that they might well have been placed under strict, perhaps even central provincial control. And timber cut from them was probably used to construct the massive quays and wharves in Londinium. And a 2nd century writing tablet from London, again from London, comprises part of a legal document recording the sale of a 5-acre wood in Kent, which underlines the importance that woodland held for local communities. Now, we were very fortunate to locate a waterlogged gravel quarry of late Roman date at Wallgarden Farm, Sipson, which had been used to dispose of a group of worn and broken timbers. These included structural elements comprising a base plate with close-set studding, which you can see on the right of the screen with a reconstruction at the bottom as to how it might have worked. Planked cladding from a clapboard or weatherboarded structures, part of a possible door frame from a dismantled building, together with a decorative fence pale, the seat of a 3-legged stool, and a runged ladder. So a really, really significant group of timber from this waterlogged gravel quarry of 3rd or 4th century AD date from Sipson. Now, as far as the ladder goes, the Sipson example is only the 6th, extraordinarily, the 6th to be recorded from Britain. The others coming from the late Iron Age sites late Iron Age site at Glastonbury, and from Roman wells in London, the Roman towns of London, Silchester, Lincoln, and Castleford. So Glastonbury apart, Sipson is the only ladder found on a Roman rural site in Britain. It's really quite an interesting and important find. Made of coppiced oak, no doubt from local woodlands, possibly up in and around Sipson or further to the north on the clays. Now the central picture on the screen you can see there is the fence pale, which has a decorative spear-shaped terminal. You can see sort of up here. This is equally unusual from a rural site. We've got some examples from Gresham Street and Draper's Gardens in London itself. Here's one from Draper's Gardens, this section of decorative fence planking. And often fences like this are shown, of this form, are shown on Trajan's Column in Rome. Now it's possible that the Sipson example originally bordered a small garden within the working farmstead. It's rather too nice to sort of be a sort of workaday piece of fence pale. It looks like a rather fancy fence pale. The three-legged stool, I haven't got a picture of the three-legged stool, the seat of it anyway. It was crudely made by comparison with the fence pale, and is the sort of homely furniture that most households would have possessed. And I've shown the reconstructed interior of a Roman house from the Museum of London's High Street Londinium exhibition, which some of you may have attended a few years ago. Now, alongside timber, cattle and corn had increasingly become the mainstays of the local rural economy, seemingly at the expense of sheep and pigs in the later Roman period. And some settlements appear to have specialised in raising stock. Horses certainly were being raised at Perry Oaks, but cattle were particularly important, or seemed to be particularly important, at Wallgarden Farm, Sipson, and here at Cranford Lane, which I've shown a sort of picture of. Picture here, a plan rather of the area of paddocks and enclosures at Cranford Lane, of sort of 4th century date. Our comparable arrangement of enclosures was located at Hengrove Farm near Staines, and that's the coloured image on the right of the screen. And these seem to have formed part of a well-organised stock raising enterprise. So both sites, both Cranford Lane and Hengrove Farm Staines, appear to have been geared to raising cattle at scale and on a commercial basis. These were cattle raising factories, if you like, cattle ranches. Now, the Cranford Lane site is also noteworthy for the presence of two small late 4th century hoards of metalwork buried in two pits around 5 metres apart. The first had been carefully arranged and comprises a lead weight, which you can see at the top of the screen here, and some links of iron chain, which you can see passed through it there and in the drawing here, on which had been balanced a flat iron plate, on top of which had been placed a large iron pruning knife or bill, which you can see over on the left-hand side of the screen here. This is a big two-handled thing, again about the size of a sort of a cricket bat, the sort of thing you would use with two hands. It's a heavy piece of kit. And curiously, of course, the Cranford Ironwork Hoard is one of many such deposits which seem to be made at the end of the Roman period. We get again and again and again deposits of ironwork on agricultural settlements. Cranford Lane looks to be another example. The second hoard comprises 7 small copper alloy coins on the right-hand side of the screen there, you can see, which from the date must post-date AD 350 or 360 and could go as late as AD 400. So these are really very, very late Roman finds. But certainly by the time they came to be deposited, they're likely to have had little monetary value. Probably wouldn't have been much use to their owners in terms of purchasing power. Now, if we step back and combine the evidence from the West London landscape sites with that recovered from Imperial College Sports Ground and Sipson Farm, it allows us to make one or two additional comments about the age and orientation of the tracks and droveways that connected them. I mentioned this earlier, this network of trackways across these, linking these various settlements. The earliest of these trackways may well, on this plan anyway, comprise the dogleg north-south example that links Sipson Farm and Wallgarden Farm settlements. So that's this sort of dogleg trackway running north to south through here. Now this may well have Bronze Age origins. It does seem to go all the way back to the Bronze Age, certainly at Sipson Farm, and there are elements of Bronze Age ditches lining up on it here at Wallgarden Farm. Others, like the major east-west trackway, linking the settlements at Imperial College and Cranford Lane, so that's this one here. This is a really big, impressive trackway, up to 40 metres in width. This could have been of much more strategic significance. And the wide and much used track heads east to cross the Crane at presumably the eponymous ford of Cran Ford, and may well have facilitated this large-scale movement of cattle to market in Brentford and perhaps London beyond. So this is a really, really significant major trackway which links big settlements of Imperial College and Cranford Lane. And we're coming towards the end of the talk, but it's noteworthy that the Saxon settlement of 5th and 6th century AD date focuses on the area, or in the area, around Harmondsworth, which itself is strategically located on the River Colne, and which later developed into a village of some local significance. See the picture on the right of the slide, you all know the centre of Harmondsworth village, with the church and the great barn beyond it, and the 5 bells in the foreground. The Saxon activity around Harlington, at the other end of the A4-M4 corridor, appears to be a bit later, but is focused on the River Crane, and suggests again that these local rivers, the Crane and the Colne, provided access corridors into the hinterland in the post-Roman period, much as they seem to have done back in the Neolithic, nearly 4 millennia earlier. Now, it might be thought that all of the early past that I've been talking about this evening had disappeared entirely from view or from memory. That's not quite true. If we look at the boundary of Harmondsworth parish, for example, which is coloured sort of pinky purple on this plan I've got up on the screen, this is Roke's map of West Middlesex or Middlesex in the middle of the 18th century, and I've picked out the parish boundary of Harmondsworth in that sort of pinky purple colour. If we look at that boundary, which was probably laid out in the 8th or 9th centuries AD, we can see that it actually encompasses a series of much earlier landscape features. Now, these were presumably used as markers where other topographic features like streams or breaks of slope were absent. So part of this eastern boundary here, we've got those 2 Shakespeare hills that Moses Glover refers to, here at Fernhill and at Caesar's Camp, or Shaftesbury Hill, further along, and part of a small barrow cemetery at Imperial College and Sipson Farm further to the north. So we've got 2 sets of barrows here on which this boundary seems to have been aligned. So in this billiard table flat landscape, you used any topographic feature, upstanding topographic feature of note. So these much earlier earthwork sites were pressed into surface as medieval parish boundary markers. And away to the west, out at Perry Oaks, we've got the reuse of a stretch of Bronze Age ditch as part of the parish boundary. And there you can see it at the bottom of the screen down here. So, what I've attempted to do in the last 40 minutes or so is to summarise some of the main findings from a nearly 20-year project, all of which we hope to publish as part of a molar monograph in the not too distant future. We've been working very hard on doing that for the last, well, before lockdown anyway. We're now waiting for referees' comments to come back before we reconvene and bring it through to publication. Now, there are a number of highlights. The likely presence of these late Pleistocene land surfaces beneath the brick earths, the Neolithic house at Cranford Lane, the possible causeway enclosure at Mayfield Farm, the aurochs burial at Holloway Lane, the organised Bronze Age fields at Cranford Lane, the tightly dated Iron Age settlement at Stockley Park, the Roman cattle ranches at Cranford Lane and Woolgarden Farm, and so on. We've got a lot of highlights coming out of this project, backed up by a plethora, a huge amount of very, very detailed research that's gone on. If we step back from some of the minutiae, we can see that population levels across the West London terraces were very likely to have fluctuated over time. There was no steady exponential increase in population through time, as you might expect. Instead, at certain times, such as the 3rd and early 2nd millennia BC, and perhaps the early 1st millennium BC, and the mid-1st millennium AD, the local landscape may well have been very nearly deserted and ripe for recolonisation and reuse. At other times, such as the later Bronze Age and perhaps the later Roman period, the carrying potential of the land must have been exploited to something approaching maximum level. Now, these fluctuations may have been the result of any number of factors, including things like climate change, agricultural overreach, sort of soil exhaustion, etc., together with bouts of famine and even disease, and perhaps, who knows, something like the pandemic in which we currently find ourselves. These may all have been reasons why the landscape was deserted at certain times. The picture I've put up on the screen here, finally, shows members of the West London Archaeological Field Group at work. And it's fair to say that without them, without volunteers, including some from the Ruislip Society, sites like Woolgarden Farm and Holloway Lane would simply not have been tackled. We simply wouldn't know what was going on there before they were destroyed. So I just want to wind up my last slide here by just paying tribute to the number of people who have helped us to put together what I think is a really, really interesting and enriching story, which I hope you've enjoyed hearing about this evening. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for listening. And if there are questions, I'll try and answer them. Thank you.
That's great, John. Thank you very much indeed. What an absolutely fascinating talk. I don't think we've ever had a speaker who's encompassed such a wide range of history from tens of thousands of years ago right up to more recent history. So it's amazing in one talk to hear that continuous progress of humanity and pre-humanity and what immense traces they have left on the landscape for you to find. That is perhaps equally surprising, that, there's so much that by dint of clever and archaeology, and modern techniques like statistical techniques, Bayesian theory, I think you mentioned, one can improve one's understanding so much of our forebears and distant ancestors. That's absolutely fascinating. So as you say, I'm sure there'll be masses of questions for people to ask. So over to the audience now. You can either type in the chat window or you can unmute yourself and just speak if you've got any questions for John. So I'll get rid of John's screen and fire away if you've got any questions. Anybody? Don't forget to unmute yourself if you want to talk.
Can I ask why you think they had all these causeways into the enclosure that you showed us near the beginning?
Well, it could be, as I said during the talk, the causewayed enclosures could well be communal, sort of collective efforts, and it may well be that that an individual family group would, as it were, construct a length of ditch, leaving a causeway before the next door family constructed their length of ditch. Now, not all those causeways, not all those gaps may well have been entranceways. They could well have been infilled with earth and timber. but I suspect it is a reflection of the communal nature of the activity. The fact that it was a group of scattered families coming together at certain times and in certain places to construct these enclosures. And it was gang work, basically. That's essentially, I think, how we tend to explain those causewayed enclosures, the causeways within the enclosures.
Thank you.
Can't see.
Anyone else? Just far away.
Excuse me, Simon.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes, yes.
This is Jenny Yule here.
Yes.
May I ask our speaker something, please?
Please do. Yes.
Yes. I'm sorry, I wasn't able to see the first part of your programme. I apologise, I came in rather late, so you might have said this already. Forgive me if you have, but obviously it's so near what we know now as London Airport Heathrow. I might be treading on difficult ground here, but were you able to discover anything that might have been under what is now our beloved airport, or has that not been at all possible?
Yes, I mean, a good deal has been found underneath the airport and probably still survives to this day under the airport. One of the key sites that I mentioned earlier in the talk was Caesar's Camp at Heathrow, which is now underneath the main northern runway. That was a site that was recorded by antiquaries back until from the 16th century onwards, and was surveyed in the 18th century and excavated prior to the construction of the airport in 1944. Another key site was the area beneath what is now Terminal 5, which was excavated in the 1990s and the noughties, and that also produced a vast amount of archaeology. But the sites that I was really talking about lay to the north of the airport. Now, that's not to say that at some future date, who knows, we might get an opportunity to look beneath the airport itself, because I'm sure there is archaeology surviving there undisturbed.
That's just exactly what I was thinking, because in my childhood, I used to fly from what is now Northolt. There was no Heathrow then.
Yep.
It was London Airport was actually Northolt in my childhood, and I used to fly from it regularly. But quite what would be under there now, have you any idea?
Well, I suspect, I mean, I made great play of the fact the sheer quantity of Bronze Age field systems which cover that terrace, and they go all the way around the airport. And underneath the airport, I suspect you're going to get a very similar sort of picture. Lots and lots of interlocking Bronze Age fields with embedded settlements, cemeteries, trackways, droveways, etc. And no doubt, probably even earlier Neolithic monuments.
Right,
So
thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else want to ask a question? No? Okay, well, I can understand perhaps why not, because John's given us such a comprehensive talk and doubtless anticipated most things that people might have asked. Well,
I say, hopefully, we are a long way down the road to publishing all of this stuff. So within the hopefully next 2 or 3 years, there should be a sort of thumping big book, which I hope you'll all look out for.
Yep, that we will indeed. So that'll be absolutely fascinating. I wonder quite how thick it will be. So yes, several volumes perhaps.
One big one, certainly.
If there's no further questions, all it remains for me to do is to thank Jon once again for such an absolutely fascinating talk. And for those of you who missed the beginning, it will be available. A link will be emailed out to members who want to watch it again or who were not able to join us this evening. So thanks again to Jon, and in a moment you might want to show your appreciation by clapping or clicking on the thumbs up or whatever else one does virtually. But before I ask you to do that, just to remind you that our last meeting of the season is next month on the 19th of April, when the speaker will be Kathleen Tyson, whose topic is 1066, the siege, surrender, and the triumph of London. So a slightly more modern period in history, but still over 1,000 years ago. So I hope you'll be able to join us next month for that last meeting of the season on the same Zoom link that you used this evening. So without more ado, thank you very much indeed, Jon. That's absolutely fascinating. And let's show our appreciation with applause or whatever else you wish to do. And some of you have found the icon. That's great. So thanks a lot. That's superb.
Thank you.